Hi, I'm Eric Cytrynbaum, and this is the BC COVID-19 Modeling Group's report for September 1st, 2021. So one big news item for the group that I want to highlight here is that we've got our own new Twitter account. So if you want to get notified of any reports that are coming out or other related updates, you can follow us on Twitter. We model and analyze data to make sense of what's going on in BC and occasionally in other places. Sometimes our reports are boring, and those are great because it means we're not facing impending doom. Sometimes our reports are gloomy, and we hope the government ends up doing something to change our destiny. For this report, we're kind of in a limbo somewhere in between those two extremes. Here's the summary: a transition period with growth continuing but slower. So the first point that this report is going to emphasize is that mandates and the public response to rising case numbers have slowed the spread of COVID-19. The interior, with the earliest restrictions, shows the strongest slowdown. So cases are now growing at about 2% each day, which, if they were left to do this for so long, it would be a doubling time of 40 days. That's almost certainly not going to be the case, the doubling at least, because this rate is likely to change before the 40-day doubling period we're looking at there. So the mask mandate in BC has not shown up in the data yet. It's too early. We never see a transition like that appear so quickly. In the interior it has, but the rest of BC it won't, and that's very likely to reduce growth rates further across the rest of the province. So the importance of vaccination passports is clear based on what we've seen happening. People are getting vaccinated, but the earlier people do that, the better, both for themselves and for the reduction of transmission. So the number of patients in hospital in BC has been rising exponentially, in keeping with our previous predictions that the hospital and ICU case numbers are not decoupled from the rising case numbers. But interestingly and unfortunately, there's an increasing fraction of ICU, so more increase in the ICU than in hospitalizations. And vaccines, more evidence that vaccines are proving to be effective across age groups, reducing cases 12-fold and hospitalizations 29-fold once fully vaccinated. Okay, so I'm going to get through these points. I won't go through these in the videos. These are in the hard copy of the report if you want to look at them or peruse them here by pausing, but I will jump right over to the next few slides, which those points kind of describe. So the important point to note here in this slide is that we can see that the growth that we were seeing earlier in this month has slowed slightly. There's a bit of a bend there, and that bend is largely due to changes in the interior, but also changes outside of the interior across the rest of British Columbia, even though the BC-wide restrictions have not had time to make an impact yet in this data. So looking at region by region, you can still see there's a rise here, although there is a slight bend in many of these regions, not all, and you can see the interior has almost or flattened depending on which of those health regions we look at. So in this slide, we're looking again, I've shown this before, this is Dean Carlin's model showing projections from July 28th. Now, I just want to emphasize, I use the word projection because what we're doing when we make a projection is we say, if things remain the same, in other words, people's behavior, mandates, and so on, no new variants crop up, we feel fairly confident that we can predict what's going to happen in the future, but we call it a projection because this is highly conditional on things not changing. The background conditions, the background parameters not changing. And so here's our July 28th report picture across part of the province at least. And you can see that now not only in the interior has this rapid growth stalled out or at least decreased to a lower slope, we're starting to see a lesser kink here in Fraser, Vancouver Health, slight kink in Vancouver Island and Northern as well. Now, the only place where measures were introduced long enough ago for this to actually already show up in the data is in the interior, but we suspect that behavioral change independent of the recent imposed new measures are causing a slowdown. So in other words, people were just hearing about the growth in the interior and changing their behavior even though there was no mandate to do so. All right, so here are another set of points. Let me go through these actually. So the big question is, we have this new BC-wide mask mandate effective August 25th. Will that be enough to turn this around? We have no idea yet. That's why I said in the intro that we're in a kind of limbo for now. Growth rates have clearly begun to slow, as I've shown on the previous slide. But it takes time, to about 2 weeks, for case data to reflect those kind of changes in growth. And so we have to wait a little while longer before we can say anything with confidence. So how do we sort of get a gauge whether it's going to be enough or not? Well, so the interior, even though they have that mandate in place already for longer, they're continuing to see growth, even though it's slower, despite the mask mandate in the central Okanagan and more broadly in the interior more recently. Other evidence, a 2020 study, and there's a link here if you want to click that and follow it through on the PDF version of the report, compared states in the US, and they found that mask mandates reduce the daily growth by about 2% per day. And if that's true here, that would flatten the current growth in BC. So we'll see if that pans out. And then we also have a history in October 2020. We saw growth rates increase significantly as activities moved indoors. So we're looking a little bit further ahead here. Maybe in September, based on this item here, we'll be flattening the curve, but then we have to be aware that there's a chance that things are going to get worse when we move inside more and close windows. So this new BC mask mandate could make a big difference, but that depends on a few things, which is that people actually wear the masks. In other words, we adhere to these restrictions, and if we use better masks, so higher efficiency. And there's a review of masks you can check out if you're wondering about how to do that best. All right, so let's take a look at the impact on healthcare. We talked about this in our last report, and this was a big item. And so I won't go over those two items here, but I'll just go look at the data. So here we see what's going on in hospitals and in the ICU. So you'll notice, as I pointed out in previous reports, there's this lag between the case numbers where we've got a dip here and then a rise, and now we're starting to level off a little bit there. And you'll notice there's an echoing dip a little bit later with a lag because people are admitted and stay in hospital. This is occupancy, so people stay in the hospital for a while, and that introduces a lag in this data. Same with the ICU numbers here. And so hopefully what we'd expect to see is a little while later we'll see a curling off of these curves, but right now we're seeing a pretty rapid increase in hospitalizations and ICU occupancy as well. And one thing worth noting is that, and I'll show this in a couple slides, the ICU number of cases in the ICU has risen disproportionately to hospitalizations, and we think this is likely due to increased severity due to Delta. Okay, so here is a bit of data fitting to those that hospitalization data. So you can see these are exponential fits, and even though the hospitalization data is higher, the exponential is a little bit more slow growing, and it's got a 15-day doubling time, whereas the ICU is actually doubling more quickly. And this is, we think, a reflection of that increased severity, possibly other explanations, but that's the one we're inclined to believe here. So, and another look at this, if you take a look at the fraction of these, so this is share of COVID-19 hospitalizations in the ICU, you can see that it's bouncing between 20 and 40% for a long time, and now it's rising even above 50%. So here we see Dean Carlin's model, and you can see here's the BC-wide data where we've got this kink after now a breakpoint has been picked up due to a combination of the measures in the interior and change in behavior through the rest of the province. So what's going on with the hospitalizations in ICU, you can see the projection here is increasing dramatically, but the cases, the actual data is a little bit lower, and in the ICU it's reversed. So this reflects what I was just saying in the previous slides about the ICU fraction going up. So this slide is addresses the question of what's going on with vaccination and hospitalization. So how effective are the vaccines at keeping people out of the hospital? So what we've got here is an age cohort breakdown. So you've got 20, 30, 40 somethings, and the graph here is showing how much of a factor change there is in their chance of ending up in the hospital. So for the younger cohorts here, under 60, you can see they're all in the roughly in the 32 to 128 range. So that means that if you're, let's say, 30 years old, you're something like 50 times less likely to end up in the hospital. You'll notice over 80, that number drops down. It's still bigger than 1, obviously. You're like something like 8 times less likely to end up in the hospital. This is complicated by a bunch of factors, which involve things like testing rates in long-term care facilities and other issues. Now, all of this data here is not taking into account correlations between socioeconomic status and vaccination status, for example, and other effects like that. So, but this is roughly a ballpark kind of set of figures to tell you how well the vaccinations work to keep you out of the hospital. So here is a little bit of a wider view on that. So here we have 4 different versions. This is the same plot that I just showed you, breaking down how much less likely you are to end up in the hospital as a function of your age. And then the other ones here, this was with 2 doses of vaccination. And the other 3 panels here, the ones on the top are how much less likely you are to get infected with COVID-19, and you can see most of the younger age cohorts, in fact, right across the board, except for the 80 pluses, which have that extra complication that I was describing before. They're in the, let's say, 8 through 16-ish range. So that means you're, let's say, 8 to 16 times less likely to get sick with COVID-19 if you're vaccinated and in any of these age cohorts. And like I said, the 80 plus is a bit of an exception because the data has a very different structure to it. And again, here there's that socioeconomic potential for socioeconomic correlation with vaccination and other factors like that may complicate this, which are not accounted for in this data. But then here we see what happens with the first dose. And you'll notice the first dose has a similar trend to it, but these numbers are all lower. So if you're only dosed once, you're not as well protected. But you are still protected. You know, if you were not protected at all after a first dose, all of these would be at 1, and clearly they're not. All right, so let's move on here. So the next few slides are going to talk about the vaccination rates, and I will not go through the details here on this slide, but I will show some of the graphs here. So the recent announcement of the vaccine passport has stimulated some people in BC to get going with a vaccination. And so it rose, the vaccination registrations rose from around 3,700 a day last week to 6,800 a day this week. So that's more than a 50% increase in the number of vaccinations. But if you add those up over time, that still doesn't get you very far to the 733,000 eligible unvaccinated people out there. So it's an uptick, but it's not enough to really make a rapid dent in the numbers. So here's a view of the impact that the vaccine passports have had on encouraging vaccination. You can see in both Quebec and BC. In Quebec, it was July 8th. In BC, August 23rd. You can see in the orange trace here, there was a delayed bump in the vaccination rate. And in BC, you can see it was dropping lower, and then it's come up more recently. But neither of those are dramatically out of range with vaccination rates we've seen so far. Okay, so we've seen this fit before, but now we have new data, and a lot of these numbers are just higher because cases across the province have increased, case counts have increased, but we're still seeing that as you look at the vaccination status of various community health service areas, those that are less vaccinated have generally higher case counts per 100,000 than those with high vaccination rates, which tend to be lower. And this is a regression estimating that variation across the vaccination fractions. So just as a sample up here, communities with 70% of eligible people vaccinated have 4 times more COVID-19 cases than those that have a 90% vaccination rate. All right, so here we're going to move out of province to Alberta and Saskatchewan, mostly because there's concerning data coming in from those provinces. So I'll let you read those with a pause if you want, but I'll just go ahead and go through the slides demonstrating them. So here we have Alberta and Saskatchewan, and this is on a linear scale and on a log scale. And remember that this is Dean's model now with COVID Classic tapering off here in all cases, being taken over by Alpha, and then Delta moving in as Alpha disappears. And so you can see the same thing that we've seen in BC, this rapid increase in cases, which is not being addressed there in either Alberta or in Saskatchewan. And they're looking at a sustained growth of 5% per day in each of those two respectively. So that's a doubling time of just under 2 weeks. So here are projections for both Alberta and Saskatchewan under the assumption of no action. So obviously if action is taken, these are not going to be relevant projections anymore. But what you can see is this rapid exponential growth and rise well above their May peak. And the same thing holds for Saskatchewan as well, although their numbers are an order of magnitude lower, their daily cases. And you can see the projections for hospitalizations look similarly dismal. They're already getting close to their May peak now, but it'll continue rising if no action is taken. Here is introducing the assumption to that projection of a rapid expansion of vaccination, and you can see the details here if they're increased by 20,000 per day or 5,000 per day for each of the two provinces. And you can see that it's actually not wildly different. You have a long delay here before they really see an effect, because those people have to get vaccinated and then wait a while, take their second, wait a while again, and so it's not super rapid turnaround there. And if you superimpose on that vaccination expansion measures to reduce transmission, then you start to see a more rapid solution or partial solution to the problem. Note that the projections are still going above their April-May peaks. So the Delta fourth wave in BC of COVID-19 infections is in transition now. It may be slowing down in its growth, or we'll see in a little while, maybe a week or two, whether it's actually turning around and coming under control. That's yet to see. The measures taken in the interior have nearly stopped the growth in cases there. In other regions, growth rates have begun to slow, even though the measures that have put in place would not be reflected in the data. So that's just independent behavioral decisions without anybody telling people what to do, which is great to hear about. So with the mask mandate expanded to all of BC and schools reopening very soon, transmission rates are really, they're in flux. This is the limbo I referred to in my opening slide, or the second slide. And we're hopefully going to see more about those by the time we have another report in a few weeks. And again, as we've mentioned in previous reports, hospital capacity is a big issue to watch, and our neighboring provinces are at greater risk than we are because they haven't put in measures yet, or aren't going to. Hopefully they will. But that's something to keep an eye on. All right, so I hope everybody stays safe in the transition back to schools and whatnot, and we'll see you in a couple weeks for our next report.